Hi, I'm Alex with Kodiak Woodcraft. In this video, we're going to be building this set of cornhole boards. Now, I love this project, and the reason is that it's super adaptable. Depending on your skill level in woodworking, or even the types of tools that you have, there's lots of different ways to get these built. If your goal is to have fun outside with your friends and your family, you cannot go wrong. Anybody can build these. With that said, as we work through the video and talk about each of the different steps, I'll do my best to mention a few different approaches that you can take. Alright, let's get to building. In order to make cornhole boards, you'll need 2 quarter sheets of plywood. I'll put the rest of the dimensions and the gory logistical details of the entire build in the description so that we don't get bogged down here or anywhere else in the video. The first step in the build is to pre-drill each board for its cornhole. Not sure about the terminology there, but we'll roll with it anyway. Once you've pre-drilled, there are a bunch of different ways that you can cut the hole. I chose to use my big 6-inch hole saw. The advantage of this route is that it does make very nice, clean, perfect holes. On the flip side, a hole saw of this size can really screw up your wrist if it catches mid-cut and torques on you. The key is to take it slow. The clips that you're seeing here are sped up. Another approach here would be to use a router in some sort of 6-inch circle template. If I was building tons of these, I think that's what I would do. The final option, if you don't have a hole saw or you don't have a router, would be to freehand the cut with a jigsaw. Now, I don't have as steady of a hand as I'd need to do that as nicely as I'd like, but it's a perfectly fine option, especially if you're taking more of a quick and dirty approach to the build. After cutting and cleaning up the holes, it's time to build a frame. When it comes to a lumber selection, I would suggest matching the quality of your top. Since I used a pretty nice birch plywood, I chose to use a clear pine for the frame. Now, if I had used a lower grade plywood, I'd probably do the frame with 2x4s. I like to start by cutting the 4-foot sections and attaching them to the top. And then I cut down and add the shorter runners after that. If you have a drill press, this is a good time to pre-drill or even completely drill out your longer side pieces where they'll eventually intersect with the legs. Otherwise, you can tackle this later. If you read my description, you'll know that you had options when it came to the thickness of the top. 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch, either works. Make sure to note that if you did choose 1/2 inch plywood for the top, you're going to want to install a center support on your boards as part of the frame. Otherwise, you'll get too much bounce and the Cornhole Commission will shut you down. For the sake of demonstration, and to build a super sturdy set of boards, I did use 3/4 inch plywood, and I still installed a center support even though I didn't have to. The last thing we need to talk about here is the method of joinery. Again, tons of options. I went with pocket holes. It seemed appropriate given the materials. The simpler option would be to simply screw the frame together with regular screws. If you take that route, just make sure to pre-drill so that you don't split any of your pieces near the ends. Of course, if you're building your boards with something super high-end like Baltic birch, that might call for something fancier like box joints. Once the frames are done, it's time to add the legs. Now, there's a very specific way that I like to do these to make sure that they come out at the perfect angle. One preliminary tip here: make sure to mark which legs go with which boards, and also on which side they go. The first step here is to clamp your leg pieces into the corner of the frame where they will ultimately live. Carefully measure for center and then drill through both the side of the frame and the leg at the same time. What you're doing is creating a hole for a carriage bolt, so make sure to use your preferred method to drill as straight as possible. This is one of the steps where you may be thankful for having identified and marked your legs. Let's say you drill this hole at 93 degrees instead of 90 degrees. It really won't matter if you don't mix up the legs. Now that you've got your bolt holes drilled, it's important to take off some material at that end of the boards so that they'll actually rotate into their game day position. The first thing that I did was mark a semicircle on one of the legs, which I would later use as a template for the rest. I hogged off most of the material at the miter saw, and then I used my sander to sand down to the line I'd marked. Now, if you don't have the right tools for this, you can use a jigsaw, it's no big deal. Once my first leg was rounded off, I traced it onto the other 3 and then repeated the process again for each of them. I did my best to keep the legs as consistent as possible. After this, the next step is to attach the legs to the boards for some measuring work. You'll want to use some sort of temporary support to raise the top of your board up to 12 inches in the air, which is exactly where you want it to end up. Now, you're going to do this at the edge of a table or some other flat surface where you can extend the leg past the edge of the table. Then, use a pencil to mark exactly where the leg intersects with the tabletop. That is where the cut will need to be. If you are a precise builder, you really only need to do this with one of the legs, and then replicate that angle on all 4. That's what I did. If you're not so sure about your build, and you think that each of the legs might need to be a slightly different angle, you can repeat the same step for each of them. The next step is to actually cut down each of the legs to that identified line, and then to assemble your boards for a test fit. For each leg, you'll run a carriage bolt from the outside in, through the leg and a washer, and then you'll use a wing nut to tighten down on the leg. The wing nut is important so that you can easily loosen and tighten the leg by hand. If you've got everything right, you'll end up with 4 smooth spinning legs, and when you place the board on a flat surface, it should be extremely stable. At this point, you'll want to disassemble and do a bit of final preparation for any finishing that you're doing. For me, that meant filling in some plywood voids with a paint-grade wood filler, and then doing some quick sanding to make sure that it didn't have any rough spots. Alright, so at this point, the boards had been built and it was time to get to finishing. So, I told you earlier, I learned some lessons here and I'd like to share them with you. The first step of the finishing was priming, and that part was pretty straightforward. I used some plain white primer that I had around, and I did 2 coats on both boards, and that was that. The first coat of black base coat was similarly uneventful. I had some paint left over from my ceiling painting project, and I just used that on the boards. I did a couple of coats of black. Now, for that part, I did have to be super careful because the paint was very flat, and I didn't want to scrape it up or scuff it up before I got to the finishing phase. Even so, that part went fine. Then it came time to paint my logo on, and that's where things got tricky. I had purchased a metal template from a company online, and the template was in the shape of my logo. It arrived very well cut and well packaged, but it wasn't perfect because it wouldn't sit all the way flat. Now, I had tried taping it down around all 4 sides, and I just couldn't get rid of a little bit of a lift in certain parts of that template. Now, the challenge was, every time I attempted to paint the logo, whether it be through spraying or dabbing foam brushes or using a regular paintbrush, I was just getting lots of bleed or overspray. It just wasn't getting a clean logo. I was repainting in between every attempt to start from scratch with a black canvas, and it just wasn't working well. So on my final attempt, what I did was I went ahead and I painted over the stenciled paint with a brush. And it actually ended up looking really cool because the logo looks hand-painted in a way, and that little bit of rustic imperfection is kind of cool with my logo. However, I wish I would have done the hand painting earlier on so that I didn't waste so much time. What I learned from this project is that stenciling can be pretty tricky. I definitely underestimated the level of challenge that it would be, especially with a less than perfect template. A couple of thoughts there. The first is that the complexity of my logo seemed to be the reason that the template was a bit warped. I think that with a simpler logo, it would have been a much better experience. I also think it might be better to try vinyl rather than metal. I just think that it would have been better at eliminating that slight warping. All that said, I did get the logo I was going for, and so I moved on to the third step. That third step was the actual clear coat. Now, I used polyurethane, and I went against the conventional wisdom, and I did not use a foam brush or one of those small foam rollers for the finish. I used a regular paint-sized, smooth surface roller, and it worked great. I didn't get any bubbles, and so I was glad to be able to save that time from doing so. I did 8 coats of clear coat on the boards themselves, and then I did 4 coats on the actual legs. One lesson here is that less can be more on the clear coats. Even though it's nice to have that nice, thick, protective, smooth surface, every time you do a layer of clear coat, you introduce a little bit of a possibility for putting it on too thick or having something trapped in it. So you have to be a little bit careful. A couple of tips here. The first is to make sure that you don't do the coats too thick. It can be tempting, but as you make the thick coats, they don't necessarily dry as clear, so it's much better to err on the thinner side. The other tip I have is to do a light layer of sanding before your final coat, or maybe before the second to last coat. And the reason for that is to make sure that you knock out any little bits of dust that got in the finish from earlier in the process. Please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss my next video. Thanks for watching.